This is Samia from the CSRC. So in a few moments, you're going to be randomly assigned to either breakout A or B, and we will let you know once the breakouts are finished. It will bring you back to this main room. For whatever reason, if you need to change rooms or something like that, you can leave your room, don't leave the meeting, and it will bring you back to this room, and we'll have a coordinator here available to move you around if you need that, okay? So I'm opening all the rooms now. So once you get that invitation, go ahead and join. All right, Alpha, I'm going to leave you and I'm going to join breakout B, and Val is going to be in breakout A.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you.
Adjudication. We just wanted to talk about adjudication generally in this breakout and think broadly about adjudication. But I suppose there's some fundamental questions such as should we adjudicate at all? So does anybody want to kick off with any overarching or general comments that's been burning? Thomas, do you want to kick off? That would be fantastic.
So Tom Flagg, I'm a medical oncologist. Really glad to be invited to the meeting, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. So two kind of oncology perspectives on this. One would be that there are some cultural differences the way we do, or whatever, scientific ways in which we run cardiology trials and oncology trials. And you know, I understand oncology trials pretty well, and obviously I think most people understand the cardiology. So one of the challenges is going to be thinking about how the oncology trials are traditionally done. Maybe more sponsor driven, probably less panel driven with adjudication and so forth, and how to make that fit. So I just want to make that large, high level comment around that. As I listen, as I recognize that part of it. The second thing is when I see cancer patients, if I have a late stage bladder cancer patient on third line therapy, I will think of them in a certain way, right? We're trying to get some more time, some good quality time. And that's the focus. If it's a adjuvant therapy, and giving nivolumab with curative intent around surgery, it's a tremendously different way. I think about that patient, the risk on that patient. And I think anything we think around adjudication should put into curative intent, non-curative intent, late stage other options as they think about it. So again, just offer a couple of oncologic perspectives there.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think we've certainly heard many ideas about where adjudication might be necessary, where it might not be necessary. And I agree with you, Tom. If somebody's got very advanced heart failure, then or very advanced cancer, then it may not be necessary. So I think we can probably agree with that to some extent. But again, the cancer, the cardiovascular risk of these people might also be very high, and it's conceivable that some of these people death is hastened. And maybe some of the people who have got less advanced cancer, they may not be quite in the same situation. So there may be some value in people even with advanced cancers.
I just add maybe one more thought, which would be to say the long-term follow-up, particularly those curative intent patients, is to be a huge gap right now, the way I see things.
Yeah, I'm going to take my hand down, but I completely agree, Tom. I mean, you know, it's not about slowing drugs down. It's not about blocking drugs. It's providing clinicians the knowledge of what to expect that I think is so critically important as someone that gets called about these patients, you know, and it's impossible to ascertain sometimes.
Great. Okay, can we go to Rob Jones next?
Yeah, so I'm Rob Jones. I'm an oncologist, and what Thomas is saying now is correct, but of course there is a sort of there's innate perversity in this, because what we do in oncology is that we have this sort of concept of sort of indication drift. So we start off in patients with advanced cancer, and it's often only late in the line, often even post expiry of the drug patent that we actually start giving these drugs to patients who actually, even before receiving the drug, have a very low risk of dying of cancer. So actually, and of course, we pay most attention to toxicity early in development. So we do need to adjust the whole way we look about toxicities and when we address them. And I guess it's
and how is the baseline assessment going to help you that when the patient has a symptom or when you're concerned about the symptom in an asymptomatic patient, how are you going to know there has been a delta? So I have, whenever we talk about the definitions, I think we have to talk about categories of drugs.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a theme that goes through all of this, which is, do we have a blanket approach, or is this based on mechanism of action? And Tom, you may have some thoughts on that. Or
I was just going to address your first question. Should it be a standard minimum? And I think that there's a real push now in the oncology world to accept, especially for immunotherapy trials, that there should be an extended standard minimum. If you look at the ASCO guidelines, which were just published in 2021, I think last week or the week before, they have now started to have this conversation about having baseline EKGs and considering baseline measurement.
I don't have all the answers, but I think that is key to keep in mind.
Well, let me ask you, Anita, and thanks for joining. It's great to see you. How do you feel, for example, about much the way we design cardiovascular adjudication based on the phase 2 experience or phase 1 experience, about trying to identify signals in early phase studies, which would then inform the approach for adjudication in the pivotal studies?
Yeah, and I think, again, I don't think we could get in the early stages. So really, it's about very critically looking at that CTCAE or whatever methodology that's utilized to identify these signals, because that's where we are lacking right now. And to expect the oncologist to start doing something else right from the beginning is going to be very hard.
Can I be bold and ask about the CTCE in general? I think we heard some shortcomings of the CTCE, and I think Ninian's walking us through the different buckets that people with heart failure and cancer trials might fall into. There are 8 or 9 buckets and 5 stages of severity, and certainly in the cardiology world, heart failure is heart failure. Obviously, we appreciate reduction in left ventricular function is also important to capture. So how do people feel about CTCE? Is there support for it, or support for changing it, or how big a change do we need in this area?
So if I may say something, Mark, thanks. I think that we've sort of intimated that we don't want to interrupt how oncologists do clinical trials, and at the same time, we'd like to get more precision to what cardiovascular events are. So part of it might be, how do we integrate the signals that are picked up from CTCAE as to not change oncology practice? But I think, as we saw in the ponatinib experience, right? Sometimes it's just a number of things, like, if somebody just has a isolated MI, but there are other things that are not there in CTCAE, those are the things that get adjudicated out. So there's potentially a more algorithmic or quantitative approach or chair review approach to looking at some of these events that we might be able to put in sort of at least as a first step before plunging into full-blown adjudication.
Yeah, I mean, stated another way, John, maybe improving specificity.
Mm-hmm. You're so much more eloquent than I, true.
No. I mean, I learned all of this from you, right? So, what we saw in the ponatinib experience was good sensitivity, but lower specificity on the basis largely of symptoms in many cases that ended up not being related.
Right.
So maybe we're thinking of a CTCE process which merges with ICOS. Is that a reasonable reasonable way to approach it. Obviously, a lot of effort from ICOS. Lavanya, what's your take on this?
Just as a kind of to know the process a little bit from the oncologists. So how do these things even get reported? At least in the US, someone may end up being cared for at a center for a complication like pulmonary edema or something. And so then is it the responsibility of the primary oncologist once an event occurs to then report it, and that's only if they're in a trial? Or what if the drug has already been approved? Is there also that responsibility or expectation that then the oncologist, even though the drug is approved, then has to report that to the drug company? I mean, what are the logistics, and who is doing this coding? Because I would argue, of course, left atrial enlargement is no longer in the CTCA as we learned, but for a cardiologist, that's a very, I don't know, kind of silly thing to be recording. So is it just kind of depending on how good your team is to be recording this kind of stuff? Is it all? How does it work from the oncologists?
I'm happy to chime in if that's helpful. A couple of things here. Again, I think there's that long-term requirement just in general about recording toxicities that people see off trial, right? So I think that sits out there, and that's probably used to varying degrees by different groups. During the trials, I think Alice mentioned this, there's a timeliness to it. So I think that's true of a lot of trials. You have to get something in quickly. What I've seen in practice, certainly in most places, is that the teams will fill these things out. The providers will then have to look at that and change it. But I think people use discharge notes, occasionally call specialists, but it's the oncologists filling that out and putting in codes. The sponsor, sometimes there's a back and forth saying, here's some other ideas around it. It's essentially up to the investigator that does that. And that's where I think the approach in oncology might be different than, say, cardiology, but Lavanya, that's what I've seen happen back and forth. Then you get another swing at later on, right? You get a more final report as additional data come in and so forth. But you can imagine some places that's driven more by the team, even though there's a sign off by a provider, and other places where the provider is really, the oncology provider is doing that, talking to specialists. That'd be best case scenario.
And to take a page from cardiovascular trials, Lavanya, I mean, there's a gap, clearly. They're different, but site-based reporting more often than not, again, suffers from the high sensitivity, somewhat lower, but not terribly lower specificity. Where it gets challenging is in this space, in cardiovascular events, it's hard to adjudicate myocardial infarction. Let's just be honest. And probably one of the most common calls that I get, and I see several of my colleagues, Mike Fradley, who I trained with, Rudolph de Boer, now that troponin has become highly sensitive, it's really troubling. Quite honestly, when troponin was a lousy assay, it was actually a pretty good test for cardiotoxicity. But now, I mean, really, truly, a person can develop a troponin rise and or fall from just drinking too much alcohol, and so getting a really toxic chemotherapy agent that has a survival benefit associated with it can very well be flagged as being cardiotoxic. And that's where having clearly defined strategies for adjudication, not to block a drug, but to save it, might actually be, really crucially important. And this is not just about circulating biomarkers, but imaging biomarkers as well. So I'll get called about a rise and fall of troponin related to a myeloma drug. This is the latest one that I'm dealing with. And we get the site-based MRI report, and it says findings consistent with myocarditis. Then we go to a blinded, experienced trialist radiologist who looks at it and goes, what? No way, So it gets even more complicated because the experiential knowledge of individuals at the sites may be somewhat limited as well. And so that's where a centralized process may actually have a huge advantage to potentially not only save a drug, but remove a blemish that might have been put on during a more broad-based approach for judging risk.
Right. I mean, there is an approach to adjudication where you basically adjudicate the site, right? Once, and you say, okay, that site's a pretty good site. We'll believe, they're doing a good job. They have the right staff, and we will believe anything they do. Whereas, maybe you're at a university hospital and you have cardiology consults, and theoretically you'd get a better result there than, say, at a community hospital that doesn't have the same level of support.
Yeah, so it does seem that having cardiology input into cardiology events might be reasonable. So I suppose a question I would like to ask is how many people or how many cancer sites do have cardiologists on site and how many don't? Because if there is a cardiologist doing a cardio-oncology clinic, or not even a cardio-oncology specialist, but somebody who understands cardiology, is that 10% of sites or 90% of sites, or how many sites could use that? Because I think going back to Jonathan's point, that would be, we'd all be comfortable if a cardiovascular specialist was looking at events.
So actually, Dr. Deswal, I'm curious, are there oncologists at your site?
Well, I think, sorry.
One. I have a phone going too, sorry about that. But, you know, the way is how to partner, right? If there's a way for the FDA or some other the agencies to mandate the involvement or collaboration of a cardiologist on site with looking into the cardiovascular events before they go in, that may be too much, you know, but is there a way to do that so that there is some screening at baseline what goes in? And the second point would be, even if we were to get the CTCAE or whatever other system updated for something that makes more sense from the cardiovascular perspective, could those events then be looked at by cardiologists to adjudicate in some ways from CTCAE so that they're just not counted, like you gave the ponatinib example? Like, is that realistic to think about?
Judy, I would love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, so this is actually something that we have some hopefully helpful experience with, where we use different methodologies, but if you had CTCAE codes that were, you know, possible cardiovascular events, one way to make it both faster and cheaper is to use centrally trained local adjudicators who have access to the EMR and the imaging and so on, which is a lot simpler than, you know, collecting the records, redacting, sending it someplace, and so on. And that will eliminate a lot of the noise and can be quick and not very expensive. So that, and will overlay on your existing system.
That sounds like we're coming to a very sensible consensus already, that we have a variety of different ways of doing this. But I think that sounds like a great idea. If somebody trained centrally but working locally sounds like a good option anyway. Leo, we'd love to hear your perspective.
Hi, everybody. I'm Leo. I'm one of the clinical directors at Merck. So I'm on the back end for running clinical trials. So just to point out that when cardiac events or any events get reported, they are you put in the term and they show up coded in the as part of the MEDRA dictionary. They do not have to match the terms of CTCAE. In other words, you can report pretty much any term, and if they don't match CTCAE, we don't really know how to grade them. So it's kind of vague grading, right? So all the terms that were not in the CTCAE that were mentioned in the initial session, you can report all of those.
Yeah, and that's what happened in the ponatinib study, right? Essentially, you know, a person could have agita after eating an Italian meal, and it would get reported as angina, you know, chest pain, because that's what it closely matched to.
Correct. And we do try, at least I try as much as possible to consolidate terms that seem synonymous. But I mean, to give you, this is a little different, but low platelets and thrombocytopenia actually code to different terms.
Yeah.
Many terms. So just because you see like one myocarditis, but it may be coded as something else, we do try our best, but things slip through sometimes. And so you don't always have entirely the full picture of cardiac events.
Yeah, so Leah, how would it sound to you allowing the CTC or even the measure terms to funnel into a system that allowed description of how many people with myocarditis or heart failure? Would that seem like a reasonable thing to report in trials from an industry perspective?
So I've tried. I'm like, can't we combine the terms, the measure terms? We know they're synonymous, and we can't seem to on our end because ultimately, whatever the investigator reports, we are not allowed to change. Right. So if you report a term, we can't change it, which is the right thing to do. Right. Pharma should not be allowed to change what an investigator reports. But as a result, we have no way of funneling them.
Yeah.
It has to be a change from a regulatory perspective.
Well, luckily we've got regulators listening at the moment, so we're hoping they're inspired to maybe nudge things in a great direction. Great, Leo. So thanks for that. It's really interesting to hear your insights. Rudolph's going to tell us the answer to this whole problem in the next 30 seconds, which is welcome.
It is very interesting what Leo just said. I didn't realize this. So apparently, this whole, let's say, classification is murky, and myocardial infarction can be a large MI or it can be like a grazing shot and a very small thing. So I guess hearing all of this, it really pleads for collecting some objective evidence, or leave it be. There's probably no in between. If I hear all this, I mean, the coding, of course, gives you a hint towards potential cardiotoxicities that are present in certain percentages, but they don't tell you really how toxic they've been. So for that, you need to collect objective evidence. There you go again: EKG, troponins, echocardiography. It comes up with numbers, continuous traits that will help us to appreciate what toxicity really occur. And I realized that is a lot of things to collect.
Rudolph, you were involved in ICOS definitions. So could you tell us, I wasn't involved in ICOS, I had some peripheral sight of it. How were they envisaged to be interpreted or used? Was it purely for clinical, or was there an eye on using these as definitions in cancer trials?
I was not involved, Mark, in those ICOS definitions.
Okay.
No, we have with the Heart Failure Association Europe, we came up with pro formas on how to assess cardiovascular risk before potentially cardiotoxic oncolytic drugs were administered. And that in itself was already, I believe, a 3 days workshop and a lot of back and forth quarreling. But that was even just, assessing cardiovascular risk, how to do that right.
So that's another topic we were hoping to touch on, obviously not solved today, but touch on was what should be the baseline assessment of people in trials in terms of the characteristics from a cardiovascular standpoint and investigation. So maybe we can move on to that. So we'll maybe do that after Rob's going to comment as well. So Rob, what's your angle?
Yeah, it's really just reflecting a little on the mismatch between CTCAE and what we want here, because I think we need to be careful we don't accidentally stop recording adverse events. And I wonder what actually is the key here is not so much the CTCAE, but the way things are presented. And if you could separate out how we list adverse events and then how we list those where there is a high degree of objectivity, and maybe actually what you need to do is report these separately. So you report all the adverse events, because that is important. We're never going to get away from that. But actually you then look, because particularly in randomized trials, it's those objective measures where you see the differences between the arms and to be able to say, well, these are objectively proven, whether that's through adjudication or whether it's because, it's an event that could only be established on a very specific investigation. And then at least we can read them separately.
Yes, so Rob, I think certainly from cardiology trials, we do that. I think John's point is we can do that. So whether it's CTC or A's reported as measure terms, then we can funnel these towards some cardiovascular assessment into buckets. So I think AEs are clearly, we love AEs and report them like you do. So it's I think we can put our heads together and understand processes and probably come up with something which includes an evolving CTCE as well as our conventional terms, which get sent for adjudication in different buckets, or certainly, or even investigator assessment of it, if not formal adjudication. Leo, another thought?
Just on again from the back end, we do have ways that we bucket events that we can report. So, for instance, on Keytruda side, we do these adverse events of significant interest, right? So there are ways that we can say, okay, these measure terms we're gonna funnel, we're gonna report on these separately. This is mostly for health agencies, but I'm sure it can be shown otherwise. And in theory, you can do this for any events that are adjudicated.
And when you do that, Leo, I mean, let me ask you, I mean, because really you've identified an opportunity, right? You've got sort of a bottleneck where things are coming to you and your group. You know, this is where things might be able to be triggered, right? You know, so if you have a possible myocardial infarction, for example, you know, having the ability to go somewhere with that and have it formally adjudicated in a manner that, I mean, you know, let me give you the example of the diabetes drugs that we've recently sort of, you know, swarmed into cardiology now. They came from cardiovascular safety trials where these drugs, Dr. Petri and I both worked on these studies, were adjudicated for their safety, and lo and behold, they were actually found to be beneficial. It's the same idea, you know, I mean, essentially reserving the high level events for adjudication while still capturing the AEs so that we don't miss those, as Rob was saying.
May I ask, when we say adjudication, are we referring to a third party or are we referring to the pharmaceutical company by the safety group?
Yeah, I mean, it's typically an objective third party, you know, I mean, and in the process of clinical trials, the formal way to do this is to blind the adjudicators to the treatment assignment. So, you know, it'll be a little bit harder here, obviously, but nonetheless, even with the knowledge of treatment assignment, you can at least have formal criteria for saying certain complex events. And you know, so let's say, I mean, if we were going to, and this is a question for the group, if we were going to adjudicate, what events should be adjudicated, right? So I'll throw it right out there. You know, myocardial infarction immediately should be one that should be at the top of the list. What else? You know, Rudolph, you're a biomarker guy.
Heart failure, Jim. Heart failure, definitely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, right? I mean, so there's a consistency among those of us that do this. I mean, you know, heart failure, myocarditis, my God, for cancer chemotherapy agents, I mean, top of mind, you know, and the Lake Louise criteria for infective myocarditis, I'm not so sure they necessarily apply here, you know, and so it really is important to take a step back and think about, you know, redefining the definitions might be necessary in order to really help to mitigate the risk and burden on sponsors that do these trials.
Yeah, so other thoughts? Judith has got a comment again.
Hi.
Judith.
Hi, yes, Mark, thank you. So I'm a nurse by trade, and I've been doing adjudication for probably close to 15 years in clinical trials. Talking to Dr. Januzzi, I have done those huge diabetic cardiovascular trials, okay? I started out reviewing cases in those as a nurse reviewer, and now I work at Clario as a senior director in their adjudication group. And what I'm hearing from what this whole conversation just supports why adjudication should be done. but it needs to be done right. It needs, you know, those measure terms and those SMQs need to be in place, and those events need to trigger to a group that's independent, and we need to have experts looking at those cases and basing their decision on source documents that we get that support that event. And they either get to say yay or nay. It's an event or it's not an event based on those definitions that we have in their charter. So I just think it just supports like doing adjudication right, but the problem is not everybody knows how to do it right. I feel like that sponsors have a really hard time because many of them don't really know the standards for adjudication that should be followed, and they don't know if they really need it or not. So they really need guidance a lot of times, and unfortunately, I don't know where they go to for that guidance. So I just wanted to have my little say.
Judy, that's really great, and you know, you are a pro at this. I mean, we've worked together over many years, and I guess what I would say is, you know, who do they go to? I mean, people who do this, right? I mean, and one concern that I have is that, you know, there's a perspective, and this comes up a lot. It's not just in this space, but you know, so Mike Bradley, when you get called about a patient who's got, you know, AF with RVR, chest pain on a drug, and it's not a curative intent, it's to, you know, try to buy some time. You know, there's the concern of we don't want to slow things down. We don't want to stop treatment if we can keep a person going. And the same thing goes with drug development. That is not what we're talking about. I mean, we've already heard that a few times today. And the goal here is clarity. The goal here is to know what to expect when something happens. You know, had we known about the frequency of myocarditis, not high, but measurable in checkpoint inhibitor experience, there wouldn't have been that sort of collaborative scramble to organize cases and get them to the New England Journal to help provide guidance to individuals about how to manage these folks.
And Dr. Januzzi, I just want to say that currently my team is working on a huge program, on oncology program. It is respiratory in their adjudication events. However, they have a way, this sponsor has a way of identifying, the adjudicators are assigning the CTCAE for the events when they adjudicate as well. So it could be different from what the site is reporting, but they have a whole way of treating that patient written into their protocol. If they hit a certain CTCAE, they have to be withdrawn. They have to, you know, they have to be treated in a certain way. And they have a group that works with the site and reaches out to them. So there's a lot, and then they can put the patient back on if the patient's, you know, respond to the treatment. So it's not about stopping, it's about patient safety. It's about, you know, making sure that we're taking care of these patients and doing it right and not putting them at risk, but also giving them that life-saving maybe drug that could help them to get better.
Yeah, Mike Fadley's got a comment. Hi, Mike.
Hey. So I'm sorry if this is repeating what's already been said. I had to step out for just a moment, but you know, I think that when I have been involved in some of these adjudication issues, especially as it relates to arrhythmias, you know, I think what strikes me is the fact that, you know, really we need to be involved as early as possible, and you know, especially with, you know, pharmaceutical companies. There's still all of these silos that exist between, you know, the oncology divisions and the cardiology divisions, and there's not a lot of crosstalk between the two in terms of, you know, developing and designing things at the front end, so that we are, you know, not scrambling after the fact to decide if this is a real problem or not, and then utilizing only the CTCAE to guide our decision making. And again, I see that a lot with AFib and some of the issues that have arisen with the BTK inhibitor. So to whatever extent we can begin the process proactively and really talk and interact at design level, I think would be hugely helpful.
Yeah, Mike, I think that's a really, really sensible comment. And I think we need to have a halfway house and also build the process. We don't necessarily want revolution, we want evolution. So, I think that's excellent. And also, to be frank, the cardiology world is evolving when it comes to capturing outcomes and events and not strictly double-blind adjudication in all angles. So there's investigator reported, as long as you can trust the investigators, that they've got the correct expertise for assessing that particular event. So that perspective of maybe looking at individual sites, are there cardiologists on site? Maybe you don't need to spend a lot of money on adjudication in some sites, maybe you do in other sites. So I suspect there's probably a process, and I think, Mike, you're right, getting involved in the design at the start and thinking about the individual trials would be the right way to go.
So at the risk of showing my own personal interest in this topic, and Rudolph, I'm going to lean on you for the answer here as well. Is there a need for optimization of triggers for identifying events, specifically biomarkers, for example?
Yeah, that's a philosophical question. I guess, well, it could go both ways. Clearly, by, for example, taking standard measurements of biomarkers, you will introduce additional noise, but I'm not so afraid of that. And unlike the US, we have been blessed with high sensitivity troponin here in Europe for over 12 years.
Yeah, rub it in, why don't you?
we're getting, so many of the signals really are noise. And so I'm not too afraid of that. And I think they can help you to tease out and make sure that you look at the truly suspicious cases and filter out a lot of things that are really not cardiology, so to speak. So yes, I think we're taking now baseline troponins in all our patients that will receive immunotherapy in the future, and you'll be amazed. I don't know, 30% of people or so walk around with elevated troponins. No problem, but it helps you if there's a rise. It helps you to truly interpret that in a correct manner. And so I think the answer is, it's a long story. The answer is yes. I think baseline biomarkers would be helpful in filtering out those patients that are particularly high risk.
Yeah, and Rudolph, thank you for that. I mean, the challenge that gets created is when a therapeutic agent causes an abnormality in a biomarker, whether imaging or circulating, that is, essentially tangential effect of the drug with respect to, say, systemic stress, and doesn't necessarily it's not attached to an event that we can define. It's injury, but it's not myocarditis, it's not a myocardial infarction. And so we're left.
I agree. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no,
if
please.
It's such an artifact, and it's also very useful to know early on, because otherwise later, as has been said, many drugs are initially evaluated in the very severe category, but later on they're more globally used. So then it's good to know if there's such an artifact, that it's not a true toxicity, but it's rather a not real signal.
And that gets to what Dr. Deswal was talking about earlier about, getting some framework in place in, say, phase 1, phase 2, so you know what to expect when you go pivotal. And then you can link those changes in troponin potentially with events or not, right? I mean, we did that in cardiovascular terms. We did that with the omecamtiv mecarbil studies, which this is a drug that causes a rise in troponin. We knew this in phase 1, phase 2, but went to phase 3 with the knowledge that we would track whether that was associated with risk, and it wasn't. So we were at least forewarned and forearmed, so to speak. Dr. Deswal.
Yeah, I have a slightly
contrarian view. I have never seen so many elevated NT-proBNPs and I did heart failure before I came to MD Anderson. It's just so non-specific, and you can correlate it with echo measures. We send them to cath. Their filling pressures are not elevated. I would be a proponent of baseline, because that's how you evaluate, did people change at least? You take out some of that noise. But I still am not convinced that doing biomarkers repeatedly, even like in checkpoint patients, I feel we can slow down their cancer treatment and create a lot of angst. I'm worried about that, unless there are really specific scenarios, like you mentioned, the omecamtiv story, of course, where you see a signal, but just at baseline, even in phase 1 or 2, to try to put those in may kill drugs or take it away for noise.
Yeah, so Anita, let me just say, I'm the card-carrying biomarker person here in this session, and I completely agree with you. I feel that often in drug development programs, people are playing with matches, as we say. They're measuring things with the intention of screening for toxicity and not necessarily understanding the potential impact of a therapy that might affect normative change. I mean, having a baseline NT-proBNP is fine, but it changes, right? And so that's the challenge, I think, is trying to understand in whom should the markers be measured, when they should be measured, and how to interpret them.
Great, yeah, but obviously there's lots of it. Biomarkers are fascinating, and so is cardiac imaging. We could talk about that as well. So can I ask for some more oncology comments before we finish? I don't know, Tom or Rob, if you got any reflections on some of the cardiology chat.
Happy to chime in. It's a great conversation. I'm glad to be part of it again. It's there are differences in the way we probably approach trials as specialties, which it's helpful to think through. One thing I just threw in the chat is that this idea, one thing that struck true to me was this idea of inclusion in the budget, the study budget of on-site cardiology adjudication. That might be just a practical step that we could sort of do. That's a certain approach. I think there's, and again, thinking about this differently, maybe it's in those late stage trials that are small and in late stage patients, you're looking for those acute near-term signals, right? And really the need for that long-term, this idea of looking long-term, those randomized larger studies, and thinking adjudication differently in those settings.
Yeah, so Tom, we have, my group has pretty good data on the unpublished that, actually there's good data that's published that when cardiologists evaluate cardiac conditions, adjudication adds no further value. So just having money in for a cardiac consult might do the same trick, whereas in sites that do not have cardiac consult, those are ones that might need adjudication. And I would bet that they harmonize in between them. So that's actually a strategy that might be helpful.
It could be a formal consultation clinic. They could be a patient at an event off-site. We just need them to look at the records with you and make a call.
But just a cardiac review.
Line item in the budget.
Mm-hmm. And we also have pretty good, and non-cardiologists don't do a very good job on cardiac cases.
Yeah. Another thing, we could even bunch some of these and actually look at them together as an external group. We don't have to do it real time like we do in a lot of the trials. That could add huge value and would be less expensive, because we do need to make sure that companies don't end up with a huge bill necessarily. Rob, have you got any more comments or reflections?
Yeah, I guess just maybe just a note of caution. One of the problems we have in oncology trials, and I'm sure it's the same in cardiology trials too, is that the more complex we make the trial, the smaller the less representational the group of patients who enter the trial is, and therefore the less relevant the results of the trial are. So we need to just be careful that we don't actually reduce the feasibility of the study such that it actually means the trials are less pragmatic than they already are.
Yeah, I think that comes back to the whole let's not hold up cancer therapy development. So whatever we do, we need to be very careful and make sure that we do this together. But I think there sounds like there are some solutions which might not be very difficult to implement, and we could do some sensible things which improve things markedly. So that looks like we're wrapping up. So Jim, it was a pleasure to work with you.
Thanks, Mark.
And an honor, of course. So maybe we should press the leave breakout room button and go back to our wrap up session. So thanks for a great breakout session, guys. Fantastic.